There are some loves, Lila once wrote, that even death can't silence. Shadow doesn't speak, but he's the loudest voice in my world. Welcome to Veil Marks, where we bring you stories that don't just entertain. They stay with you long after the final word. Today's story is a quiet kind of heartbreak. But inside that heartbreak lives a love so true, it redefines loyalty. This is not just a story about a dog. It's about a bond that transcends time, illness, and even mortality. Please stay until the end. There's a lesson here, one that might just change how you see the world. Every morning, just as the sky began to shift from a deep blue to the soft hues of dawn, a lone figure appeared at the edge of Maplewood Cemetery. It was always around the same time, just after 6, when the silence of the small-town graveyard was gently broken by the soft patter of paws on gravel. A large pitbull, muscular but visibly aged, would trot through the cemetery gates without hesitation, as if he belonged there. His fur, once perhaps a brighter color, had dulled with time and weather. His eyes, a deep, soulful brown, seemed to carry a weight too heavy for any creature to bear. The townsfolk had started calling him the Grave Dog. No one knew his real name or where he came from, but everyone knew where he was going. Without fail, the dog would weave past rows of tombstones with a determined gait, ignoring the squirrels that sometimes darted across the grass, paying no attention to the birds chirping in the trees. His destination was always the same: a modest grave near an old oak tree at the back corner of the cemetery. The headstone was plain, white marble with a few simple words etched into it, but the dog never looked at it. He only laid down, always in the same position, with his front paws stretched out and his head resting gently between them, his nose just inches from the stone. Rain, snow, bitter wind, blazing heat, nothing could keep him away. Some mornings his fur was soaked through, droplets clinging to his whiskers. Other days he panted heavily under the summer sun, yet refused to move into the shade. Even in the dead of winter, with snow piling around him, he remained in place, stoic, unmoving. He wouldn't bark. He wouldn't whimper. He didn't chase after the groundskeeper's truck or approach visitors. He simply laid there, eyes closed, as if in silent prayer. Locals had gotten used to seeing him there. At first, some people thought he was a stray, maybe even dangerous. But time proved otherwise. He never begged for food or water, never followed anyone home. Some tried to coax him away with treats, with warm blankets, even with attempts to adopt him, but he refused every time. The moment someone tried to lead him away, he'd retreat. And if taken by force, he always found his way back by the next morning. No one could explain it. Some children would wave to him as they passed by the cemetery on their way to school. A few elderly couples would leave bowls of water near the grave or a slice of ham wrapped in napkins. The dog never touched the food until the people left. Then, only after a long, contemplative glance, he might take a small bite, always returning quickly to his place. It was as if he were guarding something, or someone. Rumors began to circulate. Was it the grave of his owner? A young man killed in an accident? A soldier lost in battle? A child, perhaps? But no one had any clear answers. The name on the gravestone, Lila May Hart, didn't ring a bell to most of the townspeople. She had passed just a year before, according to the date carved in stone. There had been no major news around the time of her death, no obituary anyone could remember, no family members who had made a scene, just the quiet appearance of a new grave. And then, weeks later, the arrival of the dog. It was the kind of mystery that slowly settled into the rhythm of the town. People stopped asking questions and simply accepted the dog's presence as part of the cemetery itself. Tourists who came to visit relatives' graves sometimes caught a glimpse of him and snapped a photo, posting it online with captions like, "The Loyal Cemetery Dog" or "Guardian of the Dead." A few of those pictures gained attention, especially among animal lovers, but most faded into the ever-growing sea of internet stories. Yet for those who saw him in person, there was something different, something solemn and haunting. There was a gravity in the way he moved, the way he stared into the stone, the way he refused to leave. It wasn't just routine, it was grief. And somehow, even though he couldn't speak, even though no one knew the full story, his sorrow was clear. You could feel it just standing nearby, as if this animal was holding on to a love or a loss too deep to let go. And so, each morning, as the world moved on outside the wrought iron gates, he returned. One dog, one grave, one silent vigil that refused to end. Megan Hayes wasn't supposed to be at Maplewood Cemetery that morning. She had been in town for a completely unrelated assignment, a local art gallery's grand opening. It was supposed to be a quick weekend job, something simple to fill space in the human interest column. But as her rental car rolled past the cemetery gates, something caught her eye. At first, she thought it was just a statue, something oddly shaped beneath the old oak tree. But then it moved. Curiosity pulled at her, and without even realizing it, she turned the car around and parked along the curb. She stepped out, camera in one hand, notebook in the other, and quietly approached the cemetery's edge. The morning air was crisp, and the sky still held the soft pink hue of early light. Megan's boots crunched softly on the gravel path as she moved closer. There he was, a large pit bull lying motionless beside a grave, his head resting on his paws, eyes closed, as if deep in thought or lost in memory. Something about the stillness of the scene struck Megan deeply. It wasn't just the dog's presence. It was his purpose. He wasn't wandering. He wasn't lost. He was waiting. Mourning. The emotion was almost tangible. Megan, a journalist with a passion for stories that meant something, felt the tug of a narrative waiting to be told. She crouched quietly a few feet away, careful not to disturb him, and snapped a photo. The camera shutter was soft, but the dog opened his eyes. He didn't move, didn't growl, just looked at her with eyes that seemed far older than his body. Later that evening, back at her hotel, Megan couldn't shake the image from her mind. She reviewed the photo again, zooming in on the name etched into the headstone. Lila May Hart, beloved daughter, Ik ben Durt, Ik ben 23, just 19 years old. So young. There was no epitaph beyond those few words. No flowers on the grave, no signs of recent visitors, just the dog. The next morning, she returned, hoping to learn more. The dog was already there, just like the day before, in the exact same position. A groundskeeper named Joe was nearby, trimming a hedge, and Megan struck up a conversation. "Do you know anything about that dog?" she asked, gesturing gently toward the grave. Joe wiped his hands on his jeans and nodded. "He's been coming here for months now, every single morning. Doesn't miss a day." "Whose grave is that?" "Some girl named Lila. Died last year. Don't know much about her. Quiet funeral. No big family crowd or anything. But the dog showed up about a week after she was buried. Hasn't left since." Megan scribbled in her notebook, her heart beating faster. This was more than a passing curiosity. It was a story waiting to be unearthed. Over the next few days, she wandered through the town, speaking with anyone who might know more. At the local diner, she chatted with waitresses and baristas, showing them the photo. Most of them had seen the dog, but none could tell her much about Lila. She visited the town library and searched for an obituary. There was one, a short notice that confirmed Lila had died from complications of a long-term illness. No mention of surviving family, no fundraiser pages or heartfelt community tributes. Just a simple paragraph, and then nothing. It was at the animal shelter, a small brick building on the edge of town, that Megan finally found a lead. An older volunteer named Carla paused when Megan mentioned the pit bull. "We called him Shadow," Carla said, pulling out an old file. "He was brought in about 2 years ago. Had a rough start, abandoned, some signs of neglect, but sweet as can be once he trusted you. Lila adopted him. They were inseparable. Do you know what happened to him after she died? Megan asked. Carla sighed, her expression softening. We heard he was taken in by a relative out of state, but he ran away. And next thing anyone knew, he was back here, at her grave. That was the moment the pieces began falling into place. The story wasn't just about a dog mourning his owner. It was about a bond that even death couldn't break. Megan returned to the cemetery that afternoon and sat across from the grave, a respectful distance away. Shadow, as she now knew him, looked at her again, but this time, something passed between them. Recognition, maybe, or approval, as if he understood she was there to listen, not to intrude. That evening, Megan started outlining the article. She called it, "The Dog Who Wouldn't Leave." But even as she wrote, she knew the story wasn't over. Not yet. There were still questions she wanted to answer. Who was Lila, really? What was her life like? Why had she chosen Shadow, and why had he chosen to stay? The next morning, as dawn broke once again over Maplewood Cemetery, Megan walked through the iron gates, not as a journalist looking for a headline, but as someone deeply moved, chasing a story of love, loss, and a loyalty so pure it defied reason. And there was Shadow, waiting, just as always, beside the grave of the girl who had once saved him, and who, in a way, he had never stopped trying to save. It took Megan several more days of research and conversations before she finally pieced together a fuller picture of the girl beneath the headstone. Lila May Hart. Just 19 years old when she passed away. The name still echoed in Megan's mind each time she stood near the grave. There was something painfully delicate about it, like a flower that had never been given the chance to fully bloom. Megan eventually found an elderly neighbor named Mrs. Dunley, who had lived next door to Lila and her family for years. The woman invited Megan in for tea and offered her old photo albums and warm, if sorrowful, recollections. She was a sweet girl, Mrs. Dunley began, her hands wrapped around a floral teacup. Quiet but strong, much stronger than she looked. Lila had grown up in that same neighborhood, in a modest white house with green shutters just 2 blocks from Maplewood Cemetery. Her parents had passed when she was very young, and she'd been raised by her aunt, a kind but overwhelmed woman who worked long shifts at the local grocery store. Lila had spent most of her days alone, often sitting on the front porch with a sketchbook in hand, watching the clouds pass by, or drawing the birds that came to rest on the telephone wires. When she was 16, she was diagnosed with a rare autoimmune disease, something aggressive, something incurable, the kind of illness that slowly stripped away energy, appetite, and eventually, mobility. For a while, she tried to continue school, but her condition worsened quickly. By 17, she was mostly homebound, her world reduced to the view from her bedroom window and the pages of the books stacked beside her bed. It was during one of those long, lonely months that she convinced her aunt to take her to the local animal shelter. "I don't want to be alone," she had said, "but I don't want to make anyone feel sorry for me either." That's where she met the dog who would change everything. Shadow wasn't the dog most people looked at when walking through the kennels. Big, broad-shouldered, with a rough coat and a thick scar running above his right eye, he looked more like a fighter than a companion. He had been brought in after being found chained behind an abandoned warehouse, thin and silent, with a look that warned people to stay away. He didn't bark. He didn't wag his tail. He just stared. But Lila didn't flinch. She walked straight to his kennel, knelt down and whispered, "You look like you've been hurt too." The volunteers were hesitant, unsure if such a pairing would be wise, but Lila was insistent. She spent days visiting the shelter, sitting by his cage, reading to him softly from her favorite novels. Eventually, Shadow began to respond, first a slow blink, then a low wag of the tail, then finally, one day, he placed his paw against the bars of the kennel, and Lila placed her hand over it. From that moment on, they were inseparable. Back home, Shadow transformed. Gone was the hardened, fearful dog. In his place was a quiet guardian, always alert, always near. He followed Lila from room to room, laid at her feet while she painted, and curled beside her on the couch during long, feverish nights. When her body grew weaker, he adapted, never pulling, never rushing. When she began needing a wheelchair, he walked beside her, matching her pace with gentle precision. To Lila, Shadow became more than a pet. He was her confidant, her comfort, her strength. She called him her guardian angel in her journals, in her online blog, and even in the short video diary entries she recorded on her laptop. Megan watched some of those videos, shared with her by Mrs. Dunley, who had been entrusted with a copy before Lila passed. In one, Lila was lying in bed, pale and tired, her voice barely above a whisper. "People keep telling me to prepare for the end," she said, looking directly into the camera. "But how do you prepare for that when someone you love still looks at you like you're their whole world? Shadow doesn't know I'm dying, or maybe he does, and he just doesn't care. He's here anyway, every single day." In another clip, Lila laughed as Shadow licked her hand. "You're the bravest boy I know," she told him. "You saved me, even if the world doesn't see it that way. I hope you'll remember me." Megan wiped away tears as she watched. The love between the two was undeniable, simple, unwavering, and heartbreakingly pure. In a life filled with pain and limitations, Shadow had brought her freedom, in his own quiet, steadfast way. After Lila's death, it seemed the world simply moved on. There were no headlines, no grand tributes. Just a quiet funeral, a few friends, and a dog who had just lost the only person who had ever truly seen him. Now Megan understood why Shadow refused to leave the grave. It wasn't just loyalty, it was devotion, a continuation of the bond they had built in a world that had often overlooked both of them. As she stood once again beside the headstone, the breeze gently tugging at her coat, Megan whispered, "She remembered you, Shadow. And now, we'll remember her." The deeper Megan delved into Lila's life, the more she uncovered the extraordinary bond that had existed between the young girl and her devoted dog. It wasn't just companionship, it was a lifeline, a connection so profound that even death seemed incapable of breaking it. Megan found herself spending hours with people who had crossed paths with Lila during her final years. Neighbors, nurses, volunteers from the animal shelter all spoke of the same thing, the quiet, almost sacred closeness between the girl and her dog. No matter how much Lila's illness progressed, no matter how many treatments or hospital visits she endured, Shadow remained a constant by her side. There was something uncanny about how intuitive he had become. Shadow could sense the days when Lila's pain was worse. On those mornings, when her body felt too heavy to move and her breath came in shallow gasps, he wouldn't bark or ask to go outside. Instead, he would gently climb onto the bed and rest his broad head on her legs, his eyes watching her face with quiet concern. His presence wasn't just comforting, it was grounding. It gave her something to hold on to when everything else felt like it was slipping away. One of Lila's childhood friends, Julia, recalled a moment that had stayed with her ever since. "It was during Lila's last winter," Julia said. "She'd just come back from the hospital, and it had been rough. The doctors weren't hopeful anymore. But I remember coming over with a hot cocoa and finding her curled up on the couch, barely awake, with Shadow wrapped around her like a living blanket. His nose was tucked under her chin. He didn't move when I entered, just lifted his eyes as if to say, 'She's mine. I'm watching her. I've got this.'" As Megan sifted through the remaining pages of Lila's journal, handwritten in uneven letters, often trailing off mid-sentence due to fatigue, she came across numerous entries about Shadow. Not just stories of their daily life, but reflections, philosophies, even poems. "He knows before I do," one entry read. "When the pain is coming, when my body's going to betray me again, he leans into me like he's taking some of it away." Another, more heartbreaking, simply said, "If love could be measured in silence, Shadow would be the loudest voice I've ever known." Megan couldn't help but cry as she read those words. It was rare, even in her years of journalism, to witness a connection so raw and honest. Shadow had not only been Lila's companion, he had become a reflection of her spirit, her last and truest friend. One particular video entry shook Megan the most. It had been filmed just a few weeks before Lila passed away. The room was dimly lit, and Lila looked thinner than ever, her cheeks hollow, her eyes sunken but still bright. Shadow was lying beside her on the bed, his head nestled against her arm. She gently stroked his fur as she spoke into the camera. "I don't know how much time I have left," she said, voice soft, yet steady. "But I'm not afraid. Not really. I've already been given a kind of miracle. Most people spend their whole lives searching for someone who understands them. I found mine in a dog, a rescue. Funny how that works, huh?" She laughed, a weak but genuine sound, and looked down at Shadow. "He doesn't know what's coming. I think animals don't see death the way we do. But I do think he'll miss me. And I know he'll look for me. He's just that kind of soul." Then, with a sudden gravity in her voice, she added, "If I'm not here one day, I believe he'll still find me, somehow. Maybe not in this house, maybe not in this world, but he'll find me." That line lingered with Megan for days. "He'll still find me." It explained everything. The way Shadow returned to the grave every single day. The way he refused to be taken in by anyone else. He wasn't lost. He was searching. Or maybe he had already found her and was simply refusing to leave again. At the hospice center where Lila spent her final days, a nurse named Claire recalled how Shadow was allowed to stay with her until the very end. Most hospitals wouldn't allow pets, but exceptions were made after Lila stopped responding to treatment. Everyone understood that Shadow wasn't just a dog, he was part of her. "He never left her side," Claire said softly. "Even when she was unconscious. He'd lay his head right on her legs just like he always did. The room was full of machines and sadness, but somehow it felt peaceful, like he was guarding her soul." After Lila passed, Shadow didn't make a sound. No howl, no whimper. He just stared at her, unmoving, for hours. And when the attendants tried to take him away, he resisted. Not violently, but with a strength they hadn't expected, as if his very body refused to be separated from hers. That was the last day anyone saw him in the house. He vanished. Some believed he had run off in confusion. But now, Megan knew better. He had gone to her, to the place where her body now rested, the place where her name was etched in stone. And every day since, he had returned, because she had told him to. Because she had believed in him. "If I'm not here," Lila had said, "he'll still find me." And Shadow had. Again and again and again. After Lila passed away, everything changed. But perhaps the most profound shift was in the eyes of Shadow, the dog who had never once left her side. In the quiet days following her funeral, a heavy silence settled over the small house they had shared. Her aunt, grief-stricken and overwhelmed, did what she thought was best for the loyal animal left behind. She made arrangements with a family friend who lived 2 towns over, someone with a large yard, a calm home, and a kind heart. It wasn't an easy decision, but the aunt had no choice. She couldn't bear to be in the house any longer, and she believed Shadow would adjust in time. For the first day or two, Shadow barely moved. He didn't bark, didn't sniff around his new surroundings. didn't show any interest in the food offered to him. He simply laid down near the front door and stared out the window as if waiting for someone. On the third day, sometime during the early hours of morning, he was gone. The screen door had been nudged open just enough. No one heard a sound, no barking, no scratching. Just an empty spot on the rug where he had been lying. The family looked for him. Flyers were posted, calls were made. But Shadow didn't want to be found. By the time he returned to Maplewood Cemetery, it had been 5 days since Lila's funeral. The air still held the sting of spring rain, and her grave was marked by fresh soil and a few fading lilies. When the groundskeeper arrived that morning, he spotted something curled up under the old oak tree, still, silent, watchful. It was Shadow. From that day forward, it became routine. No matter how many people tried to intervene, no matter how many times he was coaxed, caught, or even carried away, Shadow always found his way back. It was as if a compass deep within him pointed in one direction only, to her. Local animal lovers made several attempts to adopt him. They brought treats, warm blankets, even squeaky toys, hoping something might spark his interest. But Shadow ignored them all. He didn't growl. He didn't lash out. He simply looked away, returning his gaze to the headstone, waiting, always waiting. One woman, Mrs. Klein, a retired nurse who lived across from the cemetery, tried for weeks to bring him into her home. "He's wasting away," she told Megan, tears in her eyes. "I leave food and he only eats when I'm gone. He won't let me touch him. I think he's still listening for her voice." And it was true. Every sound, the crunch of leaves, the rustle of wind through the trees, seemed to capture his attention for just a moment, as though he hoped that maybe, this time, it would be her. Shadow didn't behave like a stray. He didn't scavenge through trash or chase after cars. He didn't interact with other dogs or bark at passers-by. He was clean, calm, almost regal in the way he carried himself. His body grew thinner, but his posture never lost its dignity. He would sit or lie beside Lila's grave, his head raised, alert, but his eyes always heavy with something deeper than fatigue. Something like mourning. The cemetery staff eventually stopped trying to move him. Instead, they made quiet accommodations, a small water bowl placed discreetly near the tree, a patch of the grass left uncut so he wouldn't be disturbed. In the winter, one of the groundskeepers even left a wool blanket, which Shadow accepted after hours of simply sitting beside it. And every day, at roughly the same time, he would arrive. Through snow, rain, sun, and wind, he made his pilgrimage. Some days he stayed for just an hour. Other days, he didn't leave at all. Visitors would spot him from a distance and often pause, unsure whether to approach or simply observe. Most chose the latter. There was something sacred about it, something that didn't belong to the living. Megan heard story after story from townspeople who had watched Shadow from afar. "I saw him once," said a teenager named Luke. "It was late, around dusk. He was just sitting there looking up at the sky. I swear he looked peaceful, like he was with her." A local pastor shared a memory as well. "Animals know," he said gently. "They grieve. Sometimes I think they grieve more purely than we do. That dog, he wasn't lost. He was remembering, every day, like a prayer." Shadow's refusal to let go became more than just a local mystery. It became a symbol, a living testament to love that didn't end with a heartbeat. Megan wrote it best in her notes. Shadow wasn't stuck in the past. He was anchored in it, not because he didn't want to move on, but because the bond he shared with Lila wasn't something that time could dissolve. She once tried to sit closer to him, hoping he might accept her presence. Shadow turned to look at her, just for a second, and in that gaze, she saw everything. Not fear, not pain, but patience, devotion, and something that resembled longing. It was then that Megan understood what no one else seemed able to grasp. Shadow wasn't guarding a grave. He wasn't waiting for someone to come back. He had already found her in the only place where their souls could still meet. And he wasn't leaving. Not because he didn't know where else to go, but because he knew exactly where he needed to be. Megan had covered many stories in her career. Political scandals, human rights protests, feel-good community features. But none had ever affected her the way this one did. What had begun as a passing curiosity during a quiet assignment had turned into something much more personal, something that touched the most vulnerable part of her heart. She found herself waking up in the middle of the night, thinking about Lila, wondering what it must have felt like to say goodbye to the world at only 19. She thought about Shadow, lying there alone each morning, holding on to something invisible yet unshakable. The more she read, the more she listened. The more she felt, the more she knew this story had to be told, not in a short article buried in the back pages of the lifestyle section, but as a full piece, a tribute, a message, a legacy. She cleared her schedule and holed up in the quiet room of a local bed and breakfast, with only her laptop and a stack of notes for company. She titled the story, "Love Never Dies," and from the very first sentence, she poured her heart into it. It wasn't just about a dog or a girl. It was about the kind of love most people spend their whole lives searching for. The kind that didn't need words, didn't require grand gestures. The kind that simply was, steadfast, eternal, pure. Megan wrote about Lila's strength, her quiet wisdom, and the way she had saved a broken dog with nothing more than kindness and time. She described how Shadow had returned that gift in full, staying by Lila's side even after she was gone. She included excerpts from Lila's journals, quotes from the hospice nurses, anecdotes from neighbors, even stills from her video diaries. But most of all, she focused on the enduring power of connection, that unseen thread that ties souls together, stronger than grief, stronger than distance, stronger even than death. She submitted the piece to the publication she worked for, not expecting much more than a modest online response. But within hours of going live, the article exploded across social media. Shares multiplied by the thousands. Comments flooded in from every corner of the country. Readers of all ages left heartfelt messages, many admitting they cried as they read, others saying it reminded them of their own pets or loved ones lost. I read this on my lunch break and had to close the door to my office to cry. I didn't think a story could make me believe in love again, but this did. Shadow and Lila, thank you for reminding us what loyalty truly means. Soon, national news outlets picked it up. Morning shows requested interviews. Megan found herself speaking on live TV, holding back tears as she recounted the first time she saw Shadow lying by the grave. She was no longer just a reporter. She had become the voice for a love story the world didn't know it needed. And then, something incredible happened. People started visiting the cemetery. At first, it was just a few, local families, curious travelers, but the numbers grew rapidly. By the end of the second week, hundreds of people had come. By the third, it was thousands. They came with flowers, with letters, with hand-painted stones bearing messages of hope and gratitude. Children brought drawings of Lila and Shadow together. Elderly couples came hand in hand, many kneeling quietly beside the grave in reverence. Some brought their own rescue dogs, sitting with them in the grass as they watched Shadow from a distance, their faces softened with emotion. The cemetery staff built a small wooden bench nearby, and volunteers placed a donation box under a simple sign that read, "To honor Lila and Shadow." It wasn't long before Megan, along with Lila's aunt and several of the shelter volunteers, decided to turn the momentum into something lasting. They formed a nonprofit organization, the Lila and Shadow Foundation. The foundation had two simple missions. First, to support young patients suffering from life-threatening illnesses, providing therapy dogs, art supplies, and emotional support programs inspired by Lila's own passions. And second, to rescue abandoned animals like Shadow, giving them not only shelter, but love, rehabilitation, and the chance to be someone's guardian angel. Donations poured in. Local businesses pledged support. Artists and musicians offered proceeds from their work. Schools organized fundraisers. Even celebrities mentioned the story in interviews, helping to boost awareness. Within months, the foundation had enough funding to open its first small center. A bright, welcoming space with open kennels, art therapy rooms, and a garden where children could paint, read, and spend time with trained emotional support dogs. They named it Lila's Place. Megan stood there the day it opened, watching a group of children laugh as a goofy lab mix rolled around in the grass. Nearby, a quiet teen sat under a tree with a sketchbook in hand, a pitbull named Max curled up beside her. And for a moment, Megan saw Lila again, her smile, her quiet strength, and felt Shadow's presence in the breeze. Back at the cemetery, Shadow continued his daily ritual. He had become somewhat of a local guardian himself, gentle with children, patient with visitors. He still didn't accept treats or allow people to pet him easily, but he didn't run either. It was as if he understood now that he wasn't alone in remembering. One morning, Megan returned to the cemetery with a bouquet of soft lavender, Lila's favorite flower. Shadow was already there, lying peacefully in his usual spot. Megan sat down on the bench, watching him. "You did it," she whispered. "You told the world." And in that moment, as the morning sun broke through the trees, Megan felt a quiet certainty rise within her. Some stories weren't just meant to be told. They were meant to be lived, carried forward, and passed from heart to heart. Lila and Shadow's love hadn't ended. It had only begun again, this time in the lives they had touched, and in the thousands of hearts that now beat just a little softer, a little braver, because of them. Winter arrived in Maplewood quietly that year, blanketing the small cemetery in a hush of white. The oak trees stood bare, their dark branches reaching into a pale sky, while the ground, once rich with fallen leaves, lay softened beneath a fresh layer of snow. The world seemed slower, gentler, like it was holding its breath. And on one particular morning, long before the sun had fully risen, Shadow came to the grave, just as he always had. He was older now. His once strong frame had grown thin, his movements slower, stiffer with age. His muzzle, once dark, was now dusted with gray. But his eyes, those deep, soulful eyes, had never lost their purpose. He made his way through the snow without hesitation, his paw prints the only marks in the otherwise untouched white. He reached Lila's grave and lowered himself gently onto the cold ground. It was his place. The place where he had returned every day for nearly 2 years. The place where he felt closest to the only person who had ever truly seen him. Not as a dog broken by the world, but as a heart capable of love. The wind whispered through the trees, and for a long time he didn't move. He rested his head against the base of the headstone, just as he always did, his breath slow and shallow, the rhythm of a life that had loved deeply and mourned quietly. And sometime during that long, silent morning, Shadow fell asleep. And this time, he didn't wake up. The groundskeeper found him later that day, still lying there peacefully, as if simply napping beneath the sky. There was no sign of struggle, no sound of distress, just stillness, and a kind of quiet grace that didn't need explanation. News of Shadow's passing spread quickly. The same community that had come to love and respect his devotion now mourned him deeply. Flowers poured in from all across the country, letters, candles, handwritten cards from children, paintings from artists. Someone even crocheted a small blanket embroidered with the words, "Thank you for teaching us love." Megan received the call while on assignment in another state. She sat in her hotel room in stunned silence for several minutes, staring at the phone as tears slid down her cheeks. She knew this day would come. Shadow had been aging, his body slowing, but somehow she had hoped, maybe foolishly, that he'd always be there, lying beside Lila's grave, guarding her memory. His presence had become eternal in her mind. A symbol, a comfort. She booked the first flight back home. 3 days later, beneath a pale gray sky and the soft hush of falling snow, a quiet ceremony was held at Maplewood Cemetery. There were no long speeches, no loud music, no fanfare, just stillness and love. Shadow was buried right beside Lila, in the space that had always belonged to him in spirit. The two graves now sat side by side under the wide arms of the oak tree that had shaded their story for so long. A new headstone was placed where Shadow lay. It matched Lila's in design, simple white marble, elegant in its restraint. And beneath his name it read, "Shadow faithful until the end, now together forever." Megan stood quietly, holding a bouquet of white lilies and baby's breath in her gloved hands. She waited until the crowd had left, until the murmurs faded, and the cemetery returned to its usual peace. Then she stepped forward, kneeling between the two graves, her breath fogging in the cold air. She placed the bouquet gently at the base of Shadow's stone, brushing a bit of snow off the edge. Her hand lingered there, fingers tracing the inscription. The cold marble pressed against her skin, grounding her. "You did it," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You stayed." Tears gathered in her eyes, but she let them fall. There was no need to hide them. Not here. "You kept your promise, Shadow. You found her. You never left." She sat there for a while, just listening to the wind in the trees, the occasional call of a distant crow. And then she leaned forward between the two graves and said softly, "Your story will never be forgotten. I promise." That spring, the foundation established a permanent memorial at the cemetery. A curved stone bench with carvings of paw prints and stars was placed nearby, offering a space for visitors to sit and reflect. A plaque told the story of Lila and Shadow, not in dramatic detail, but in gentle, poetic phrases that captured the spirit of their bond. It became a place of quiet pilgrimage, a reminder that even the smallest lives can leave the deepest imprints, that love isn't always loud or flashy. Sometimes it's quiet, patient, fierce in its loyalty, and eternal in its reach. Years passed, but Megan returned to the cemetery every winter, always on the anniversary of Shadow's passing. She brought white flowers and sat on the bench, speaking to them both as if they were still there, still listening. And in many ways they were. In every therapy dog trained through the foundation. In every sick child who smiled again because of a soft paw resting on their bed. In every family who adopted a stray and found, to their surprise, they had rescued each other. The legacy of Lila and Shadow was not one of tragedy. It was one of connection, of devotion, of hope. Because sometimes the most powerful stories aren't written in headlines or carved in stone. They're written in moments, in quiet goodbyes, in promises kept, and in the unwavering loyalty of a dog who never stopped loving. As the snow melted each year and spring brought new life to the world, the cemetery remained a place where two hearts rested, side by side, beneath the oak tree, reminding everyone who passed by that love, when true, never really ends. It simply waits. And sometimes, it comes back, again and again, in the shape of paw prints in the snow. Faithful until the end, now together forever. That's what the stone says. But what Shadow left behind is more than just words carved into marble. It's a reminder, a message, that true love doesn't demand attention. It simply shows up, day after day, even when no one's watching. If this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing to Veil Marks. Each subscription is more than just a number. It's a reason for us to keep telling stories that matter, stories that heal, stories that remind us what it means to be human, and what it means to love like a dog. Leave a comment if this story made you feel something. And remember the words of George Eliot. Only in the agony of parting do we look into the depths of love. See you in the next story. May it be just as meaningful.